can sometimes feel like a lot, but you don't have to do it alone. I strongly believe that we're stronger together. Here, we're going to slow down, have real talks, make sense of things together, and explore ways to intentionally grow the life you want. We're going to talk about mental and physical health, relationships, money, work, and community. Welcome to Rooted in Intention with me, Karina Gomez. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Rooted in Intention. Today, we're going to be diving into reconnecting with one's roots because oftentimes the history that we're taught in school has separated us from our true history and disconnected us from cultural pride. And I know from my experience that oftentimes leaves us having to connect those dots later in life. And today, I'm joined by special guest, Melinda Grisby, who goes by Brown Girl Pride on social media. And there she's really created a space talking about Mexican history and ancestry, current events, and debunking common myths as well. So thank you, Melinda, for joining me. And to get us started, can you share a little bit about what inspired you to start Brown Girl Pride?
It was shortly after the Roe v. Wade was overturned. I decided to just start voicing my opinion on social media, which then turned into me getting more into politics on social media. And then it turned into seeing a bunch of people spreading misinformation about Indigenous people, um, Mexican history, especially the Southwest. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, so I started debunking it. And then it just led into going down these, like, every new thing that would come up kind of led me down the path to where I'm at now, where it was trying to give some kind of voice to detribalized people,
Mm-hmm.
debunking the myths of our proximity to whiteness, and understanding our Indigenous experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a huge thing in it, and how colonialism and history and even today's politics all come together to create what is happening now. And it's the continuation of our genocide, except that people don't recognize it as Indigenous genocide because of all the whitewashing of our history and our cultures and our languages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit more around your thoughts of how it's genocide and the proximity to whiteness, how that all ties into how we view these things?
I think the myth of the proximity to whiteness is most people look at it as skin tone only,
Mm.
right? And because of that, they're conflating colorism with racism. And they forget that racism applies to anybody who is non white. And so it gives this myth of proximity to whiteness that darker people within our diaspora and not in other diasporas are experiencing that same level of hate. And so conflating those things erases what's happening. It sweeps under the rug what's happening. And it seems like it makes it look like our oppression is not as quote unquote bad as other
Mm.
groups of people. Right. And so what proximity to whiteness actually is, it comes with your privileges under a white supremacist system. Right. So, um, if you're a male, you have proximity to whiteness. If you're straight, you have proximity to whiteness. If you're cisgendered, you have proximity to whiteness. If you're educated, you have proximity to whiteness. So your proximity to whiteness will always come with your privilege. And I think that's where we have to adjust what proximity to whiteness means. The reason why this is a genocide, an indigenous genocide, is because it's mostly being targeted towards the quote unquote Latino Hispanic population, right?
Mm.
And that has been turned into, well, these are just a bunch of Latinos, these are a bunch of immigrants, when they're actually indigenous people. They're indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. And so it covers up that genocide. It covers up what is happening. It covers up putting our people back into concentration camps, where concentration camps started here, not in World War II, right? It
Mm,
covers up the torture, it covers up the inhumane treatment, it covers up all of that under the guise of these are just a bunch of Latinos, these are just a bunch of immigrants.
mhm,
And so our continued genocide of indigenous people carries on, you
mhm.
know?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I think the time that I really started thinking of myself as Native American was in 2020 when the census was happening. And I was doing a lot of work around the census. And then by then, I had really dived into a little bit more of just like Chicano history and like mestizaje and that type of thing. And I was like, well, if you really take into account the history of my parents and where they grew up, I was just like, we actually have Native American blood. And there is kind of this like almost erasure of that part of ourselves and really thinking of just like wanting to reconnect with that, but also having this difficulty of claiming Indigenous roots, particularly in the US, because there's a lot of discussion around like tribes that are defined by the government and how there's so much politics within that. And that isn't necessarily what brings validity to having Native American roots. And I know you dived a little bit into one of your videos talking about the census. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the history of the census and the language and politics that goes into all the labels that are within that.
The census is probably the most powerful tool of paper genocide. It's the most powerful tool of erasing identity or changing identities. And it's under a legal aspect, right? So we can look through all the different ways they've reclassified people or have changed things. Um, when the border was created, we still didn't get the full rights that we were supposed to have according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? We were supposed to be treated, quote unquote, as whites because at the time, the Civil War had not started. So at the time, the only people allowed to be citizens were white people, right?
Mm,
When you get to the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and all of that, 20 years later, and African Americans got their citizenship, freed slaves got their citizenship, the only people allowed to be US citizens were black and white.
mm,
So all of these other people in between, this is again where we become a buffer and it erases our oppression. All these other people in between had to be one or the other for a racial category, right? So this started, and because of our treaty, it stated that we were afforded the same rights as basically white people. And so this is how we start our classification as white in the United States. It wasn't because we thought we were white. It wasn't because we were, had European blood. For some it was, but in general, it wasn't legally. It was because if they put us as black, we would be the majority as people of color.
mm,
So in order to diminish those numbers and make their numbers look larger without giving us the equity that came with that, we were classified as white. You fast forward to the 1930s when repatriation was happening. During repatriation, in 1928 is when it started, but in 1930 is when the census changed to adding a category as Mexican on the race, right?
mm,
With that, you see what's happening today. Mass targeting of people because they're classified as Mexican. People, them using the census to go in and do all these mass deportations. Over 2 million people were mass deported during repatriation.
mm,
1.2 million of those were US citizens. So the fight to put us back to white was partly because of the targeting of Mexican people. Which then we fast forward over to the 1970s, where we are seeing that our funds from our schools, our neighborhoods, all those things that would help us are getting pulled into white schools, white neighborhoods. And so they tell us, no, that's not happening. Well, how do you know if we're all considered white? but it's
Mm,
clearly in the social structure that's happening, these funds are being sent over here and not here. So that's where the push for being as a separate category as still keeping us white for legal purposes, but separating us into a different group, white, and that's where Hispanic comes into play, and then Latino. Not saying that I ever agreed with it, or not saying that I don't. I also understand why they did it, but I also understand there's nuance. There were those who really truly believed that they were white. There were those that really truly had that self hate and were like, no, we're better than black people, we're better than tribal natives, we're better than these. But for a vast majority of it, it was just about this is how we keep our people safe, this is how we keep them from being targeted. And in that process, it has helped with erasing identity or causing identity crisis where people really don't know who they are. And
mhm,
because there's so much information and so much distorted history, that it causes that fight within, that contradiction for so many people. And not even just within us, but basically any group of people who has been colonized by white supremacy.
mhm. There's so much distorted history, and just being able to like untangle everything and understand what you were saying, the nuance and the different dynamics that go into information, because I think there's so much power in having information, like with the census, right? It's something that we use to know where our resources going, where our resources not going. But then the double-edged sword of that is it can sometimes be used to target communities as well. And understanding the history of that is so important also in advocating in the future for like better protections and that type of thing. And I'm kind of curious because you have so much history and knowledge. What brought you into history? Is it something that you studied in school? Is it something that you just dive into research on your own?
I was always the why kid. I would annoy my mom and my grandparents and be like, but why? Why is it that way? Or what
Mm,
happened this? But how come they did it that way? I always needed to know the why behind everything, which gave me a natural curiosity to history. So from as a young kid, I would watch documentaries. I would literally imagine myself in those time periods and imagine being in those situations and trying to really understand that, right? Um, and then when I was a senior in high school, I came across a PBS documentary as a 5-part series. And this is why we need PBS.
yes.
But I came across a 5-point series in 2000, or a 5-part series in about 2000, 2001. And it was about the Chicano movement.
Mm,
So I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, shit, Corky Gonzalez was here in Denver. I'm from
mm,
here. How do I not know about This wasn't that long ago. How do I not know who Corky Gonzalez is? How do I not know who Cesar Chavez is?
mm,
And then so I'm sitting here and I'm like asking my friends, I was like, did y'all know who these people were? And they're like, no. And so I went to my history teacher as an AP history class and I said, I got a question. In a school that's like mostly Mexicans, why don't we learn any of our history? I mean, we learn a little bit about Black history and we learn a shit ton about World War II and the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and all of that, but we don't learn nothing about ours. And he was a white guy and he goes, you know what? I don't know. Good question. And I
mm,
go, can I bring you? Because my dad bought me the series of that PBS documentary. I was like, can I bring you his VHS and all that? I'm aging myself, right? So I bring him the series and I tell him to watch it over the weekend. And he comes back to me and he goes, as a history teacher, I didn't even know this history.
mm,
You see what I'm, and so that's what like really pushed me into wanting to know more about the history of my people and my family and everything that went with that. And so my automatic curiosity just turned into a journey of researching everything I could. I've probably watched every documentary. I've not read every book because there's so many out there, but I
yeah.
read a lot of books. I read all the dissertation papers, the boring stuff people don't like to read.
Mhm.
And then I put those pieces together, and then I create my content.
I love that you brought information to the history teacher because, yeah, I feel like we're left to our own devices to figure these things out when it's not taught in schools. And by any chance, do you remember the name of the PBS documentary in case folks want to check it out?
It was called Chicanos. That was it.
Chicanos.
It was a great documentary. It was done back in the early 2000s, and there's still some bias and more updated information. But it was a great gateway into being like, how do I not know all of this? And then I just dug. I dug and
Hmm.
I dug and I dug, and it was at the beginning of when searching for information on the internet was like, oh my gosh, I can actually find this information. I don't have to go dig through libraries and search and find and not know what I'm looking for. I can now use a tool
Hmm.
to actually look for this information. And then it also opened my eyes to how much information was actually not out there about our history,
Mm.
and that you had to not only search for it, but then like you had to search online to find it in like books somewhere that you had to purchase and read because you can't find that online.
Hmm.
And so it was a great tool for doing that, but you realize how much just isn't pushed out there.
Hmm.
So it gets disheartening at times because you're like, man, you want people to learn, but it's hard to get them to the right sources without getting to them to someone who's being misinformative or pushing traditional narratives that aren't actually traditional, that were made up and then became traditional type
Mm.
of things. So there's also that aspect of it. Is like, well, I've always heard it this way. And then you're like, yeah, but if you look at what happened before, that's not really what it is. And it's about diving even deeper. And so I've gone back to trying to understand the history pre 1492 as well.
Mm.
And that's even harder to do because there's less information about that because so much of it has been erased fully,
Hmm.
destroyed completely. And then many oral histories have changed to some degree because of assimilation.
Hmm.
So it's even distorted some of our oral histories in a way too. So that's harder to do, but it's well worth the journey.
Yeah, I had my own journey of trying to also dive into the history, just like, but how were things like before colonization? Because, yeah,
Mhm.
there's a lot of books and written materials that were burned, but then I also think of traditions that were passed on orally. Just a lot of like thinking of the shame and the fear that drove people into assimilation as a survival mechanism and how that caused erasure of some things is so important. And you were talking a little bit about some of the common narratives and how they're distorted. Would you be able to share how it's often distorted through the
Oh,
lens of colonialism?
what happens is that we are already conditioned into Eurocentric mindsets. So we're conditioned into looking at, for example, conquering, the term conquering, right? When you think of conquering, what do you automatically think of? You think of what Europeans did over here. You think of what people have done throughout history all over the world, the brutality of conquering, right? But we also forget that the Western Hemisphere was isolated from the Eastern Hemisphere for 50,000 years,
Mhm.
right? So we had a different, unique perspective. When you pull out the Eurocentric perspective of what conquering is, and when they place, like, for example, when they say the Mexica were going around conquering everybody, not in the same way in what the Eastern Hemisphere was doing. Conquering was not about taking control, taking resources, and subjugating people. It wasn't about trying to build this hierarchy. When we call it conquering over here, it was more so disputes amongst what should be done. And then those who win take over those, land areas, but not in a way that's brutal, not in a way that's oppressive, not in a way that removes your humanity, right? And so switching into that indigenous perspective is hard for people to do because you are so conditioned into thinking things one way.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're starting to go through the different time periods of history, you start seeing specific patterns. And when you start seeing those specific patterns, you can then break away from what that Eurocentric point of view is
Mm-hmm.
to what that indigenous perspective is. And you can start pulling away from different sources and seeing those different perspectives and how they line up. That's the biggest thing of how it gets distorted is it comes always from a Eurocentric perspective, right? And so even when we're talking about Mayan gods or Mexica gods, there was never a direct translation for the word God or for what Dios mean. The Spanish translated it to God because
Mm-hmm.
that's what they knew. That's what they understood spirituality to mean. And so even our spirituality has been colonized and Eurocentricized.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people that even today I'll get in disagreements with who are like, no, these, our gods did exist and we had the sun god and the thing. No, we actually didn't. But it's hard to break that. It's hard because you're taught spirituality through the eyes of religion. And
Mm-hmm.
so people connect spirituality with religion all the time and they can't, cut the difference and see where the differences are and why they're not one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see those Eurocentric perspectives in all of these different takes on history when it comes to that. And this is how those whitewash versions of history continues to get pushed, making the men the hero, erasing the women from the story. All of those things you see as a common theme, not just here, but anywhere colonized through white supremacy all around the globe.
It's very interesting, the idea of spirituality in Mesoamerica and what that
Mhm.
looked like. And I've dived a little bit into that myself as well, because sometimes when we think about Western medicine, for instance, and then also looking at what did healing and wellness look like in Mesoamerica, at least that was how I started diving into a little bit of like, what did the healing practices look like? And then that led me into a rabbit hole of
Mhm.
understanding or trying to understand spirituality in Mesoamerica, because there was such a parallel, I would say, with those two things. And I know I've read a little bit about deities and that type of thing, but I'm
Mhm.
curious, how do you understand spirituality from before?
Spirituality and science went hand in hand. So your connection to the energies of nature is where your spirituality comes from, right? But in order to understand those connections, you have to understand science. You have to be a scientist. You have to observe. You have to pay attention to the patterns, right? Um, for example, if you were to put a blindfold on, you may not see the sun, but you can feel the sun.
Mm,
You can you can tell that for a certain amount of time you're going to feel warmth. So that's daytime. And for a certain amount of time it's not going to be warm and that's nighttime and you start seeing these patterns, right? Because nature is all about patterns. So you see these patterns and then you start noticing that the days get longer during a certain time of the year and they get shorter during, so you don't have to see it to know it exists. You can feel it. You can um feel the warmth just by that. That's science. That's observing what
mm,
is happening in the natural world, right? It's tangible. The other thing is what a lot of people don't understand is like a lot of people use the blind analogy that if you can't see it doesn't mean it exists,
mm,
when talking about religion and God and so forth. But the problem with that analogy is that even blind people still have the perception of light and darkness. So if you can't see the sun, you know it still exists because you can still feel it and you can tell where the light ends and when the darkness starts. Blind people do not live in darkness all day long. They know the difference between day and night.
mm,
So when you put all that together, you realize that they are connecting someone who is blind because they've lost a sense. They can still connect to the earth. They can still connect to their spirituality, even if they can't see it, because they can still tangibly feel it. With religion, you can't. So religion removes science, because in order to believe in something that doesn't exist, you have to remove science from it. Spirituality works with science. Science proves your spirituality. It doesn't prove religion. It doesn't prove deities, right? So what we know scientifically, what the Western world has figured out, we already knew. We already knew that energy couldn't be created or destroyed. We already knew that energy was something that connected us to nature. We already knew that energy is what connected us to the universe, to all living things. And it wasn't a deity that had that connection. Now, the way our languages were cannot be direct translations into English. So our creation stories got turned into mythology instead
Mhm.
of looked at as scientific theory. We were already understanding human evolution. We were already understanding the creation, the quote unquote creation of the world and the universe. We knew these things, but the way we said it and the way it gets translated into English, it gets lost in translation. So it gets turned into mythology. People coming from the ground is taken as literal,
Mhm.
right? Ancestors from the stars is taken as literal, when in fact, your ancestors from the stars are in fact the stardust that's in your body. The quote unquote Big Bang,
Mhm.
when the stars explode, life gets created. You have all those elements from the stars in your body. All of us do. So we are related to the stars, right? We have to have water. If our people come from the water, we have to have water to sustain life. 70% of our body is made of water. So we are related to the water. Our ancestors is the water. You know, we have to have the ground to grow food. So the minerals in which we eat, that comes from that food, has to come from the ground, which enters into our body, which sustain lives. We are related to the earth.
Mhm.
Our ancestors are the earth. Same with the sky. We need air. We need oxygen to breathe. So we are related to the air. And that's where that comes into grounding your spirituality with science and nature versus religion, and how that distorts what our spirituality has become. It colonized our spirituality. It
Mhm.
changed our creation stories from science, because how powerful that we already understood evolution thousands of years before they did. You see? And then that's a secret, the lie that gets covered up at the end of the day, because our existence dismantles their lies, you know?
You captured so beautifully how things can be lost in translation. And I think that isn't something that I necessarily had thought about, how in the translation of ideas and concepts, things were taken in a literal fashion. And hearing you talk about how we are stardust, it actually reminds me of, I'm in Southern California, but we have Griffith Observatory, and they actually
Mhm.
have a show where they dive into the galaxy and the world. And that's actually one of the things that they highlight. It's just like, oh, we're all just like stardust and we are all
Mhm.
made from the universe. And I'm curious if you have any great recommendations of books or articles where folks might that want to dive a little bit more into that helped you in your journey of understanding that.
Honestly, I can give you books on history. But as far as the spirituality concept goes, that came more from one, I'm a nurse. I was an ER nurse. I'm a hospice nurse. I did psych nursing. And then I was also an Air Force medic who was in war zones and saw the destruction to what war does to the human body, both mentally and physically.
Mm.
So I've come to my understandings through my experiences, but also um, trying to understand Indigenous science, right? And as I would watch, there's a few documentaries out there. There's one that's on Timeline, and it's I can't remember the exact name. It's been a while since I've watched it, but it's Native Americans before 1492 or something like that, or Native Americans in 1491, kind of talking about all these things. And it goes into a lot of scientific realms, right? And how we did agriculture, and not just here but also comparison to other parts of the world. And the way my brain functions is, as I'm kind of taking my science background and my experiences, and then looking at what indigenous sciences are explaining, indigenous scientists, geneticists, and so forth and so on, what they're explaining, kind of taking that, it kind of shaped my perspective, and it just opened up for me. So my perspective may not be everybody's perspective, but this is how I've come to understand it, and understanding indigenous sciences. And then listening to some other content creators that I follow that decolonize language, also are in the realm of helping others decolonizing and teaching others how to decolonizing language is a real big part of that, and understanding how words don't translate. Like, Europeans wouldn't call a tree a relative, because a relative is somebody who is a person to them, right? Uh, Europeans wouldn't call the air a relative, the dirt a relative, the mountains a relative. They look at being a relative as a cousin, an auntie, an uncle. But we call it a relative because we find that we are still connected, and it provides for us just as we provide for it. So that gets that, like I said, that lost in translation thing happens. And you have to, when you start to decolonize from language, you can start separating that, and then understanding what creation stories meant. For me, I was literally sitting there one day and was like, arguing with people about creation stories. Your creation stories are just myths. People didn't just pop up from the ground. And I'm sitting there like, but that's not really what it is. Nobody's saying we just popped up from the ground, and it like just clicked. It's like, well, this is actually what it's saying. Like, this is what it's actually meaning. Even though I don't speak native languages, it's easy to start to decipher once you get it, once you see what their ways of life are, when you recognize how their traditions were, what they valued, what their morality was. You can put those pieces together, and then it opens up for you. So it's not impossible for detribalized people who don't speak the language, who didn't grow up in all the traditions or ceremonies, but you still have DNA memory. You still have your ancestors that are in your unconscious mind that can still relate information to you. You still have those things that allow you to break away from the Eurocentrism, and then understand it from your indigenous perspective, from your indigenous point of view. And that's where I think it gets intimidating for most people, because it's like, how can you really understand if you didn't grow up in the culture? How can you really understand if you didn't speak the language? Well, you listen, you observe, you did what our ancestors did, you practice science. You listen to the elders, you listen to the perspectives, you hear where everything is coming from, and then you can piece it together.
I feel like you started with a little bit of a disclaimer that it's with your life experiences, but I think there's actually a lot of power with our life experiences and how things that we read and learn through others, and how we then use things that we perceive in the world actually has a lot of power. And there's a lot of knowledge in the lived experience. And I think one of the things that you were really saying, or at least the way that I'm understanding it, is then also tapping into our intuition and
Mhm.
just being very aware and mindful of the world around us, and how that is science and how that was science within like our ancestors. And just even thinking about the way that there was a lot of knowledge around astronomy and how planets and stars worked and that type of thing. And that all came down to observing and just
Mhm.
being very aware and looking at patterns, and just thinking about how much power there is to that. And if there
Mhm.
are no books to this, I think this is an opportunity, Melinda, for you to dive in. And I know you share a lot, obviously, through your channels, but for the people that love reading, I think they would really appreciate a little bit of how you've come to understand the history that has been written there, but then also seeing it through that additional lens of like, this is my lived experience and how it has informed, and it's tying all of these things together as well.
I might do that one day. But no, I mean, it really does help. And which is why I do the content that I do, is that I'm trying to give a different perspective that otherwise somebody wouldn't have. And there's a lot of people who share my perspective. So it actually, in some ways, helps validate what I'm also thinking, what I'm feeling, where I'm coming from, when I'm seeing that I'm not the only one that sees it in this way, right? And who's to say right now if it's the right way or not, is I'm still learning and understanding. But from my perspective and from my experiences and from what I have seen on how our people were prior to 1492 versus how all of that changed afterward, you see that, like, the whole myth of the Mexica being these conquering, brutal type of indigenous group, and that's how they got the empire that they got, didn't actually line up to the cultural practices, to the spiritual practices, to their economical practices, to their political practices, right? When you start looking and breaking down, and then that's why you only get bits and pieces of what all of those things are in history. They glorify certain aspects of Mexica culture, and then they turn that glorification into justification for genocide, you
Mhm.
know? And so when you actually sit back and break down all those different parts of the culture as a whole, you're like, well, okay, if they provided equity for education, whether you were a commoner or whether you were in the noble, you know, if you were a noble, you got provided the same education. The noble children didn't get a different education from the commoner children, right? When you see that both boys and girls were provided the same education, when you see that doesn't go with the conquering type, right? That way that we understand it. When you see that what we now call LGBTQ people, when you see that they had a voice, when you see that they were treated with equity, they weren't cast out. When you see those things, when you see how they had systems of justice. If somebody stole from you, you could take that to, a council, and they can make a judgment on it and hear out the facts. When you see that we had multiple layers of those systems, that okay, if you didn't like what you got from this court system, in a sense, you can then go to the higher court system and plead your case there. When you see that, we had a combination of socialism, communism in our economic systems, right? That wasn't based off of capitalism, of money, off of needing to have the land because we thought we owned it, it belonged to us. It was about trying to make sure resources were utilized in ways where everybody could benefit versus not,
Mhm.
especially when you're growing, uh, a society. Um, so there were going to be disputes because as human beings, that's what happens. Those disputes we sometimes, and we had diplomacy. So there was steps before war. It wasn't this idea that people were just going out and just, jumping tribes and taking them over. Wasn't how that worked. They
Mhm.
had war councils. They had systems and structures as well. And while those systems and structure don't look like what we're used to, they still existed. So to make it seem like our ancestors were going around brutalizing tribes and taking over, there's actually no evidence of that. There's stories, many distorted stories from the Spaniards, um, but you don't see that actual evidence of. You see evidence of beef, of of people, arguing and fighting and not getting along, but you don't see evidence of quote unquote conquering.
Mhm.
And that's where that history has been so distorted across everywhere, from the Europeans to even our own people,
Mhm.
you know and that's from our own people trying to prove that one of the greatest empires in the world at the time could be taken down by these colonizers.
Mhm.
So trying to change that story up, and yeah, we were the biggest and the baddest and the toughest, and we even took over all these other tribes. That doesn't make it doesn't prove anything. It actually proves their narrative of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this is how we were. We weren't super peaceful because we're human, but we weren't doing genocides.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't conquering to subjugate or oppress. If we weren't assimilating, people integrated in and or they didn't, which is why the wars happened, which is why the Tlaxcalans, weren't, they were still their own people, their own system. They were fighting
Mm-hmm.
because the Mexica wanted them to be a part of them, and they wanted to be on their own. They didn't want to share their resources, and that's okay. It was their territories, right? How
Mm-hmm.
they decide that for their sovereignty. So there was going to be that beef there, but they weren't sitting here. You don't find evidence of them being conquered. They find evidence of them arguing, warring, battling in the ways of they're trying to get each other's resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it comes down to. So that distortion continues to happen over and over and over again amongst other tribes, even throughout Canada, the US, down into South America, all over the place. Even if you look at some places in the Eastern Hemisphere as well, you have to change that history to justify what happened
Mm-hmm.
and to make ourselves feel better too sometimes, you
How
know.
so?
I think a lot of times when, especially when we're talking about our diaspora as Mexican people, or people within the Latin American diaspora, because I see this amongst other groups within the diaspora as well, is that this not this it's been conditioned in us to have this duality of the Spaniard and the Indigenous, of
Mm-hmm.
the conqueror and the conquered, right? We have those ancestors. My last Spanish ancestor, like straight from Spain, was like 5 generations ago,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I think that's how it is for most Mexicans. This idea that we're still, quote unquote, 50-50, we're half and half, we're half European, we're half indigenous, doesn't exist. But it's been conditioned into that. So we have to accept the Spaniard, right? We have to accept that. We have to accept being the conqueror, but we also have to accept being the conquered. And that makes it difficult. So we might, turn our indigenous ancestors into a more of we romanticize them a little bit more instead of talking about the nuance of them as well. So it makes us feel a little bit better at not being the conquered. But on the flip side, we don't want to, not all, but there are some that don't want to accept what has happened. So they still perpetuate the white supremacy. They still, under the guise of, well, we're Spanish too. Some of it's embedded, yes, but as a whole, as like nothing else is, it's not indigenous, it's not African influenced, it's nothing. It's just pure Spanish culture that wasn't forced. What do you practice?
Mm-hmm.
Most people aren't practicing full Spanish culture. Most people don't even recognize what Spanish food is, which is completely different than Mexican food or any other Latin American food. It's way more European over there. It's not even spicy. It's not as flavorful, right? Like true Spanish food is completely European,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been distorted because of that. We're the mestizos, we're the child of Cortez and La Malinche, we're this, and then you have that dynamic too of the conqueror, the man over the woman, the indigenous. So that comes into play. The powerfulness of the man versus the subjugating of the woman, and then forgetting and distorting her story and making her look much older so she can be portrayed as a traitor versus showing that she was actually just a child who was being raped, and out of her survival she learned how to translate. So you can see the connections in all these different ways where they distort it enough to keep some truth in, but enough to change it to their advantage to still create this psychological fight within. So that's why we as people with this duality, and it's not, and then we get the rest of society on top of that pushing it. How many times does everybody say, y'all are mixed though? Y'all are mixed. It doesn't matter if they're black, if they're white, if they're Asian, wherever, even tribal indigenous people, y'all are mixed people. Why? Wait, hold on. How are we the only people over here in the Western Hemisphere mixed?
Mm,
You see it and it gets pushed as you guys are both Spaniard and Native. You're both Spaniard and Native, but you can't be Native because you didn't grow up in the culture, but you're both, but you can't be. And it's this constant confusion that gets people very discombobulated in their identity because you're getting it from everywhere, your family, society, from how they teach the history, all of that comes. And then you're like wondering, well, who am I then? And so decolonizing identity is important. And
mm.
that's hard to do because you have to deconstruct everything about your existence. And that's hard to do.
Yeah. I think what comes to mind is, oh man, I think for identity, it's one of those things that sometimes feels like it's in flux. And I think, like, for us that we're in the US, there's like the culture that is changing of what does it mean to be a Mexican in the US also is going to be very different than what does it mean to be a Mexican within Mexico or like a Latin American person within another Latin American country because
Mhm.
there's so many other politics and like geographic things that are at play with that. And I think that's why it's so it's such a call for many of us for wanting to go back and like find some of that history that hasn't been talked about and be like,
Mhm.
who actually am I? And not just I, but who were the people like in my family and what are some of those pieces that we have been like disconnected from that we want to connect with again. And
Mhm.
I think I have mixed feelings around the being mixed because I think there is the reality that we are mixed, but necessarily what does that mean and what do we want it to mean for us? And to what you were saying around the like decolonization, I think it comes into how is it that we want to look at these many different parts of ourselves is really the question for me.
So I often get a lot of people who will DM me asking me, well, what am I? I don't
Mm,
get it. I don't get it. And I tell them all the time. If you're looking at yourself as a racial group, you're never going to understand yourself.
mm,
And this is where that idea of mixed comes in, right? Scientifically, mixed isn't a thing.
mm,
Our blood is not mixed. That's not a scientific thing because race is not biological.
mm,
So you go back far enough in our DNA, we connect to everybody on the planet because we're a species, right?
mm,
Right. So everybody has admixture, everybody.
mm,
But when you focus on one group of people being mixed, that continues that identity crisis and it pulls you away from your connection to your indigeneity, right?
mm,
That's number one. Number two is I tell people, what's your culture? What do you practice every day?
mhm,
You are what your culture is because that's how people identified pre-colonization. You identify through your culture and your culture is fluid and your identity is fluid. You could be in this tribal community and then marry into another tribal community and your identity changes.
mm,
You see what I'm saying? Well,
mhm,
we have put identity into racial boxes.
mm, mhm. I like
And
that.
you know what I mean? And because we put our identity into racial boxes, this is where we can't separate. And this is why we continue to fight within ourselves of being both. You're not
Mm,
both. Well, like I said, when's the last time you practiced Spanish culture outside of speaking the language and being a Catholic?
mhm, mhm,
How many people actually know what Spanish culture is? True Spanish culture,
mhm,
without the mixture and the homogenization of the cultures here out in Spain, right? And then they also have their own homogenization. The French have their own homogenization. The Italians have their own homogenization. Everybody has homogenized at some level because culture is fluid. And then you'll have those cultures that break off and do their own thing for hundreds of years. And then those eventually homogenize somewhere else.
mhm,
When it's a natural thing, that's fine. When it's forced, That's where the loss of identity comes in. That's where the grief comes in to our identities. That's where we feel confused and don't know how to identify. And we must be proud of both. No, we don't have to be proud of both. We
Mm,
don't have to be proud of any. And it's this constant, you are all of these things. No, you are what you have been raised in, and you can deconstruct that and understand where those cultures came from, which parts of those cultures came from where. But this has created a new thing, right? And it will continue. When you This is why uh racial mixing was always a problem,
mm,
because it allowed cultures to um integrate with each other. It allowed more understanding. When tribes married other tribes, it wasn't a problem.
mhm,
Even in the Eastern Hemisphere, when you're looking at Africa and Europe, those weren't problems until they made it a problem.
mhm,
You didn't have identity issues because of your race. If you had identity issues, is because you were trying to figure out which culture to put more ahead of the other.
mm,
And those that didn't want to do that homogenize the cultures, and you get a new culture that emerges, an ethnogenesis.
mm.
You see what I'm saying? So that's the natural way of that happening. But when it's forced, that's where that loss comes in.
This is such an interesting conversation of really moving from the idea of
Yes.
identifying around, whoa, my mic did something weird, of moving away from the idea of identifying with race and more of what it is that you're practicing and seeing that through the lens of culture. And it makes me think a little bit of just creating a new family outside of the family that you were like raised in, like through marriage or whatever that looks like for folks, of the new like family unit. You take parts of each person and then you create whole new family
Mm-hmm.
practices, and then that becomes its own mini culture in a sense. And I
Yep.
like that concept and that idea of viewing identity through that lens, because I think that's what's at the core of being. Like, who are you being? What are you practicing? What are you doing on your day to
Mhm.
day? And yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it.
We've just been conditioned to think of our identity as revolving around race.
Mm,
And how much you see it in the Black community, you see it in the Asian communities, you see it in our communities. How Indigenous are you? How African are you? How Black are you? How brown are you? How Chinese are you? How Filipino are you? Are you really Chinese if you didn't grow up in China? We
mhm.
see this everywhere. Are you really African if you weren't never been to Africa? Are you really Mexican if you weren't born in Mexico?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
we do this because of colonialism, and we do it to ourselves. So when we focus our identities around race, we can't completely get away from it right now because the structures are created in race, and race has very real consequences. We're seeing that today. The
Mhm.
way you look is how you're being targeted. So that's through the racial perspective of people looking at you as, if you're this, if you look this certain way, this is what you are racially. But we have also we don't have to take on that identity. We have to acknowledge that that identity exists because we get treated a certain way because of that identity. But we ourselves don't have to take that on. We
Mhm.
don't have to center our identity around race. And when we break away from that and center it around culture, then you start healing, you start understanding more of who you are. But when we center our identity around race, we get confused.
Mhm.
I'm half this, I'm half that. No, you're not. What half are you? The top half? The left half? You know, like, I ask that to people all the time. They're like, you know what I mean? I go, but seriously, I mean, I get it, but at the same time, changing our language about ourselves is so important.
Yeah.
It's so important. Like, I get people who like, I'm just a mixed mutt. Why are you dehumanizing yourself? It was
Mm,
just a joke. Is it, or are you defensive? So it's easy. It's easy to hide what you're feeling by, I'm just a mixed mutt. Ha ha ha. Right? No, you're dehumanizing yourself.
mm.
and you're trying to laugh it off as something when in reality you're trying to understand what that means.
Mhm.
But if you can't understand it, you dehuman. And that's what they have done. That's how they have changed up the psychology of our identities as well.
Mhm.
So if people stop focusing on identifying as a race and identifying with your culture, your traditions, your people, your values, and that's who you are.
Mhm.
And you're more centered that way, you know?
Mhm. I feel like that's such a real thing. I would say for anyone that has, I don't know, ever had the difficulty of sometimes feeling like not from here, like nor from there type of thing, because we have all of this just like different background. And then to what I was saying earlier is being like a Mexican in the US is its own experience. And there comes like the evolution of the culture and what it looks like in a different country as well. So Melinda, I look forward to that book. If you are really thinking about it, I think it'd be such great stuff. And I have one last question for you because you've obviously dived into not just like a lot of history, but also done a lot of like self-reflection of what these things mean to you. What do you think has been the most impactful for you in going down this journey of understanding history and decolonization?
When I recognize that the sixth sense that we have, that intuition that we have, right? That little voice in the back of our mind that tells us, probably shouldn't do that, that gut feeling. When I recognize that was my ancestors speaking to me and guiding me, um, was when I trusted myself.
Mm-hmm.
Because trusting myself means trusting my ancestors. So I can hear them more clearly. And that's what's been impactful for me, which has allowed me to come with the perspectives I come with and bring the insights that I do, um, by learning to trust myself again,
Mm-hmm.
trusting those gut feelings,
Mm-hmm.
because that means I trust what my ancestors are telling me and how they're guiding me. So that I think is the biggest part of the decolonization process is learning to trust that, because when you can trust that, then you'll be able to trust how you're being guided and the information you're taking in, because you're going to be able to be like, that don't seem right. Well, if it don't seem right, why doesn't it seem right?
Mm-hmm.
That's something's telling you, your ancestors are telling you something's not right. So you do ignore it or do you look into it?
Mm-hmm.
And if you trust yourself, you're going to look into it. If you don't trust yourself, you're going to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
So trusting yourself is trusting your ancestors, which allows you to decolonize and deconstruct and question. Questioning things is the most powerful thing you can do, because by questioning things, you need to seek out answers and it opens your eyes. You may never get the answer that you want or that you think you want, but it's going to give you answers in other ways. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the beauty of it, because now your eyes, what's the saying where you can't see beyond your nose, you're a fool or something like that, or
I don't
however that
know.
saying goes. But like, people who can't see beyond their nose aren't really, don't have it all there. They don't really know what they're talking about. But if you can see beyond your nose, it means you can see into the universe. So what you think the answer is isn't always what it is, because everything else, now you have a bigger perspective. You have a wider lens
Mm-hmm.
instead of it being so narrow and so, um, keeping you boxed in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, that was my biggest impact. And I think for most people, if you trust yourself, you'll walk the journey that you are meant to walk.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where it comes from. And so many people don't trust themselves because they haven't healed. And that's
Mm-hmm.
part of the journey. Healing, all of this is part of the journey of land back. It's part of the journey of reclamation of culture, of reclamation of language, of reclamation of identity
Mm-hmm.
is healing. And that's part of that journey, because we have to heal from the trauma of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you move forward.
It's so beautifully put. And yeah, I think one of the things that I was hearing is the importance of trusting yourself through that intuition and kind of knowledge that has been passed to us from generations to generations. And then I think one of the things that I've noticed is being able to be guided by that and then diving into the logical, the like question seeking
Mhm.
and that type of thing, and being able to like practice the balance of those two things. Because
Mhm.
I know in the past, sometimes I've been too caught up in trying to like think the logic part first, but it's actually recognizing that like connection to self and trusting that intuition and those gut feelings, and then allowing that to guide the logical
Mhm.
process.
Yes. Your intuition is going to tell you, like, that seems a little off. I mean, I get it, but it seems a little off. And then you don't go down those rabbit holes either. You keep to the truth.
Mhm.
And that truth allows you to seek your own truth of who you are too.
Mhm.
And it allows you to, here's the thing, it allows you to understand your identity in a non-biased way for
Mhm.
yourself.
Mhm.
Most people have a huge bias against themselves. So what you think you are, you're not, because you've created that bias. So you got to pull pull that bias away from yourself. So it allows you to do that much easier, and it
Mhm.
allows you to have better self-reflection in a way that is healing versus beating yourself up.
Yeah, coming back to ourselves.
Hmm.
Well, thank you, Melinda, so much for joining me for this
Of
conversation.
course.
So happy to have you on here. And I know you're on Instagram, Brown Gold Pride, other social media channels or other spaces that people could connect with you if they're interested.
Um, TikTok for now until until the takeover happens, and then I won't be on TikTok anymore. But for now, it'll just remain Instagram until I find another platform that will be worth my time in utilizing. Anybody can hit me up there, message me. I try to get to messages as quickly as possible. Sometimes it's not always feasible, but I do answer everybody at some point.
Okay, excellent. Well, with that, is there anything else that you want to share with people that might be tuning in for this episode?
Take your journey a day at a time. I know it sounds cliche, but it really is something where you just got to kind of stop sometimes and just breathe it out, relax, and reflect.
Mhm.
Each day will bring something new, and you're going to understand that even with the journeys aren't straight paths, obstacles happen. Boulders fall and block roads, rivers,
Mhm.
sweep away roads and sweep away paths, things happen. And so you got to understand that sometimes the journey isn't going to be a smooth one, and that those obstacles are something you're going to have to learn to navigate. And it's great to learn to navigate them because it only helps you become more knowledgeable and have more experiences to help educate others and help them get through their journeys.
Yeah.
So there you go.
We need to take care of ourselves and then our community. And
Yes.
yeah, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Until next time.
Bye.
And if you got at least one thing out of today's episode, I would greatly appreciate if you took a moment to write a review and maybe even share the episode with at least one friend. And you can easily send in your review, any questions or suggestions for future episodes via text by clicking the link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rooted in Intention. Until next time, and remember to keep showing up for the life, relationships,